morning, everyone, and thank you to Marco and Daniel for the kind invite. And I've had a pleasure to introduce a good friend and a colleague of mine who's been recently appointed as the Regional Head of Sustainable Finance for HSBC in Europe and covers 21 markets. And this kind of reinforces what you've just seen in the video and our full commitment to the ESG agenda. So Alan joined us last night from Dublin, and so welcome to Luxembourg, Alan. And let's start the discussion. And based on your experience, Alan, and what you have seen around, what do you think, how are we progressing across the three ESG areas, so environment, social and governance? What are the progress across the three areas?
Thank you, Emanuele, and delighted to be in Luxembourg for this, this forum. It's a broad question, it's a very broad area. A lot of the previous speakers have touched on many of the key aspects of this, but what we're seeing in the wholesale market across our European business is, if we look at the E of ESG first, we're really seeing a maturity around companies setting climate goals, but very much focusing on what we call SBT, science-based targets, and really aligning their goals and their key performance indicators towards meeting that all-important goal set at the Paris Accord, which is 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels. So really getting very much more granular around targets. But key in this area is looking at the carbon footprint of companies. And you're looking at three scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and 2, for larger corporates, it's pretty easy to assess and control. Scope 1 carbon is what the company consumes itself. Scope 2, the energy that you purchase, and you can move the dial quite significantly on those two. However, the real key for many companies is Scope 3 emissions, and they're emissions that are embedded in supply chains. For many companies, we see supply chains straddle the globe, and there's very much now a focus on companies setting goals around how, and the market demanding on how we reduce Scope 3 emissions. Not easy to do, very difficult task, but that's a real focus in that area. Increasingly looking at the resilience of supply chains, what's in your supply chains. We're seeing a lot of legislation around, certainly at a national level. Germany is introducing legislation around the corporate due diligence, which is companies having to attest that their supply chains are free from malpractice in terms of labour practices, etc. And increasingly we're seeing demands around diversity of the labour force, also diversity at a board level as well. So the S and the G parts of the ESG are receiving a lot more attention now. However, even a greater degree of complexity for companies that we're dealing with. We're the world's largest trade bank, so we see supply chains all around the world struggling with how to decarbonize their supply chains.
I mean, thanks, Alan. That's a good segue. I mean, before we heard Mr. Gramegna talking about the Paris Agreement 2050 in terms of achieving net zero. So from a company's perspective, this transition can be quite complex. So what do you see are the key needs for a company to successfully transition to a net zero environment?
Got it. Thank you. I think, in Europe, we're in a very rich ecosystem around legislation. We've got the European taxonomy, a lot has been referred to. We've got a lot of demands coming to corporates and larger multinationals operating within the 21 markets that I'm covering in terms of disclosure. And the challenge with disclosure is having, we heard it from our previous panel, is data. Companies are struggling with data, accurate data around this most complex of area, and companies are really just starting to gather data, to use third parties. I think AI is going to be really important in terms of analysing and parsing the data that's out there. So a real struggle to gather data, complexity around that, to meet this strong legislative environment that we have, especially here in Europe. Europe is the absolute epicenter in terms of legislation, in terms of policy, in terms of products around sustainable financing. And if you look at the taxonomy, other countries around the world have taken the European taxonomy and replicated it to varying degrees. So Europe is really setting the policy. Now that's admirable, really admirable, but for companies and corporates that we're dealing with, there's a challenge of being able to report and meet those standards and really to be able to compete for capital and showing stakeholders that they have met those standards.
That's great, Alan. And I guess from your perspective, it's good because I know that you work closely also with clients to try and help them and advise and facilitate this transition, which is great. So, I mean, I know other panels have touched on the future. So clearly looking out from your perspective, what are the key trends and challenges going forward on this field?
Sure. I think the top-down focus in terms of policy that has been driven at an EU level and at a national level will be really key determinants for companies operating certainly within the European Union. Energy security, absolutely. We heard it from our first speaker. You know, the events in the Ukraine is absolutely top priority now. I think what we're seeing is the emergence of a whole swathe of new industries labelled climate tech. So you have carbon capture, you have green hydrogen, you have vertical farming, you have a real swathe of industries that will help to bend that emissions curve down. But I think from a corporate perspective, you know, when do you get involved in these new technologies? Do you wait until they're completely proven, or do you get in as a first mover? And I think the climate tech companies and solutions that we're looking at now will become mainstream, like that example around EV penetration. It's only going one way. A lot of these companies will define, there will be at the next industrial revolution effectively will be the basis of this. So companies getting to grips with new technology. I think the challenge around data is absolutely critical. And also, you know, what does a good transition plan look like? You know, I think we're struggling with that. I mean, you know, how fast do I have to move? Bear in mind that Europe has set aggressive targets, 55% reduction in emissions by 2030, carbon neutral continent by 2050. I mean, these are moonshot goals. So for companies to play in that environment is going to require a completely different level of thought, culture, and of course, you know, help from the financial system, because capital is moving away from, well, under the EU taxonomy, it's very binary, it's brown or green. It's moving from brown to green. So capital flights, stranded assets, all of these factors are at play.
Thanks, Alan. So today is obviously a great conference, a lot of material and information shared, but if you had to, you know, what you want to leave the audience with in terms of final message from your perspective, a takeaway for the audience?
Sure. I think firstly, top of the list for me has to keep up with the legislative changes. They're happening so rapidly and at such a degree of complexity that it's very easy to be, you know, for a company to be caught out. You know, so it's that horizon scanning piece is very important. Work with your advisors, etc., to keep an eye on what's happening there. I think secondly, be conscious that having a well-developed ESG policy is not just for financial purpose or financial gain. There's a much wider stakeholder piece. Customers are driving this. Customers are voting with their feet. Increasingly, employees are looking and delving into a company's ESG policies before they make the decision to actually join a company. So, and again, you know, capital, to re-emphasize, capital is moving at a fast pace towards the greener side of the equation on the ESG side. And thirdly, and finally, do engage with your financial services provider. Lean on them. There's a lot happening within, whether it's funds, whether it's the banking, wholesale banking area that we're involved in. There's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of investment there. Lean on your financial advisor when you're setting out those key performance indicators that you want to meet. So they're the kind of three top areas: legislation, ESG as a wider stakeholder piece, and engage with your financial services provider.
Alan, thank you very much. Great messages, and wish you a safe trip back to Dublin. Thank you very much for coming over today.
Thanks a lot, Emanuele. Thank you.